In the winter of 431 BC, Pericles stood before the graves of Athens' war dead and told his city it was immortal. Not metaphorically, not to comfort the grieving. He said it the way an engineer describes a structure he has spent 40 years testing, with cold, absolute confidence. He said that the whole earth is the tomb of famous men, that Athens' dead had not died for a patch of soil. They had died for an idea, a civilization, something no army could destroy. The crowd listened. The city believed. 1 year later, Pericles was dying in a city eating itself alive, and the dream he had spent a lifetime constructing was rotting alongside him. But here is what makes this more than a tragedy. The plague that killed Pericles was not an act of God. It was not bad luck. It was, in the most devastating sense possible, a consequence. A consequence of his own decisions, his own strategy, his own design. The man who told Athens it was immortal had quietly, unknowingly, built the door the plague walked through. This is that story. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what was there, and how fragile it already was. The Greece of 431 BC is not a nation. It is a pressure cooker. Dozens of rival city-states packed into a small peninsula, each one convinced of its own superiority, all of them bound together by a shared language and a shared memory. They had, against every reasonable expectation, defeated the Persian Empire. That victory was still living history. The men who fought at Salamis were still alive. But the unity that had made that victory possible had already dissolved. What remained was a Cold War. Two incompatible superpowers locked in a standoff that everyone knew would eventually break. On one side, Athens, a naval empire, a democracy. A city that had taken a defensive alliance against Persia and quietly transformed it into something much closer to an empire. Moving the alliance's shared treasury from the sacred island of Delos to Athens itself, drawing tribute from over 100 cities, using that money to build the Parthenon, to fund the fleet, to project Athenian power across the eastern Mediterranean. Athens was rich, brilliant, and deeply, bitterly resented. On the other side, Sparta. No navy, no philosophy, no monuments. Just the finest infantry army in the world. A state built entirely around producing soldiers from birth, and a growing, urgent fear that Athens was expanding too fast and too far, and would eventually absorb everything. The tension had been building for decades. What finally snapped it was a series of Athenian provocations in the early 430s, trade sanctions against Sparta's allies, interference in colonial disputes, and an economic blockade of Megara championed by Pericles himself. Sparta called a congress, announced it was fighting for Greek liberation, and voted for war. The Peloponnesian War began in 431 BC, and Pericles, who had seen it coming for years, had a plan. Understand Pericles clearly, because everything that follows flows from who he was. He was not a king, not a tyrant. He held power through a single, extraordinary ability. He could walk into an assembly of thousands of free Athenian citizens and convince them that his view of the world was correct. He had done this for 30 years. He had built the Parthenon. He had funded the navy. He had championed the democratic institutions that made Athens what it was. He was, by any measure, the most consequential political figure in the ancient Greek world. He had also absorbed, from the philosopher Anaxagoras, a ruthless rationalism that separated him from almost every other leader of his era. He had no patience for superstition, no interest in divine favor as a strategic variable. He believed that if you thought carefully enough about a problem, you could find its solution. And he had thought very carefully about this war. His grand strategy was this: do not fight Sparta on land. Ever. Athens could not win a pitched battle against the Spartan phalanx. Disciplined, trained from childhood, unafraid of death. Open ground was their territory. So deny them open ground. Instead, retreat behind the long walls, the massive fortifications connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus. Let Sparta burn the Attic countryside. It would hurt, but Athens could survive it. Meanwhile, use the navy, raid the Peloponnesian coast, keep the supply lines running through Piraeus, draw tribute from the empire, bleed Sparta economically over years, over decades if necessary, until they broke and sued for peace on Athenian terms. It was a strategy of endurance. It required extraordinary discipline from a democracy that would want to strike back every time it watched its homeland burn. And it rested on a single structural requirement that no one fully understood the danger of. It required the entire population of the Attic countryside, every farmer, every family, every animal, to abandon their land and come inside the walls. In the spring of 431 BC, the Spartan king Archidamus II, who was, in a cruel historical irony, Pericles' personal friend, led the Peloponnesian army into Attica and burned everything he could reach. Fields of grain, weeks from harvest. Olive groves that had taken 50 years to mature. Farmhouses, storerooms. The Attic countryside was reduced to smoke and ash visible from the city walls. And the people of Attica did exactly what Pericles told them to do. They gathered what they could carry, left what they could not, and walked to Athens. The numbers are staggering, tens of thousands in the first weeks, possibly more than 100,000 over the war's opening months. They camped in the towers along the walls. They moved into temples, into public squares, into any covered structure they could claim. The corridor between Athens and Piraeus, the gap between the long walls, became a vast improvised city of people who had lost everything and had no idea how long they would be waiting. Athens was not built for this. Its water supply, its sewers, its streets, none of it was designed for a sudden doubling of its population. Waste management collapsed. Clean water became scarce. Thousands of people were sleeping within arm's reach of strangers, breathing the same trapped air, drinking from the same cisterns, living in conditions that any physician, ancient or modern, would recognize immediately as a perfect incubator for an epidemic. Pericles knew the crowding would cause suffering. He accepted that cost. What he could not know, what no one in the ancient world had the framework to understand, was that he had just created the ideal environment for something far worse than suffering. By autumn, Archidamus had retreated. Spartan armies had their own harvest to manage. Athens had survived its first test. The navy had raided the Peloponnesian coast. The strategy appeared to be working. That winter, Pericles gave the funeral oration over the war's first dead and told the city it was immortal. It was the last uncomplicated thing Athens would hear for a long time. It started in Piraeus, the port, the place where ships arrived from everywhere, from Egypt, from Libya, from across the eastern Mediterranean. The place that was Athens's lifeline, the one opening in the wall that could not be closed because closing it meant starvation. At some point in the summer of 430 BC, something came ashore at Piraeus that no wall could stop and no strategy had accounted for. A disease. Where it came from, historians trace it through sub-Saharan Africa and Egypt. Nobody in Athens knew. Nobody had a concept of disease transmission that would have let them know. The obvious explanation was divine punishment, and the Athenians, in their desperation, reached for it. Thucydides survived the plague, and what he gave us, what makes his account one of the most extraordinary documents in ancient literature, is not a lament. It is a clinical report. Precise, methodical, written with the specific intention that future generations would be able to recognize this thing if it came again. He describes it like this: people in perfect health were suddenly seized with violent fever. The eyes became red and inflamed. The mouth and throat bled. Breathing turned labored and foul. Sneezing, chest pain, violent retching. Then the skin erupted. Pustules, ulcers, discoloration spreading across the body. The heat inside the body became so unbearable that patients stripped off their clothes and threw themselves into cisterns, into wells, into any water they could reach. The thirst was unquenchable. Many drowned themselves trying to satisfy it. If the body survived that, the disease moved inward. It attacked the bowels, the genitals, the eyes. Some survivors were left permanently blind. Others lost fingers and toes to necrosis. Those who died, and most did, died within 7 to 9 days. There was no treatment that worked. There was no category of people who were immune. The plague killed the young alongside the old, the pious alongside the impious, the healthy alongside the already weakened, without pattern, without mercy, without logic. Scholars have argued for centuries about what this disease actually was. Smallpox, typhus, Ebola, something now extinct. No consensus exists. What Thucydides describes does not match any known modern disease perfectly, which suggests it may have been something that no longer exists in its original form, possibly striking a population with no prior immunity at all. What we know with certainty is this: it arrived into a city crammed far beyond its capacity, packed with refugees with no sanitation and no shelter, and it moved at a speed that overwhelmed everything. From Piraeus, it reached Athens within days. Here is what Thucydides understood that makes his account something far more than a medical record. The plague did not just kill people. It killed the architecture of Athenian civilization. And that second death was, in some ways, worse than the first. Athens did not run on laws alone. Laws require enforcement, and enforcement requires people who believe the laws are worth enforcing. Athens ran on something deeper, a shared set of agreements about how to behave, what you owed your neighbors, your city, your gods, your dead. Those agreements were not written anywhere. They were maintained by the daily practice of living together, reinforced by ritual, by religion, by the public theater of democratic participation. Pericles' funeral oration was the highest expression of those agreements. It was Athens explaining to itself what it believed. The plague dismantled all of it, methodically. First to go, religious order. The temples filled with the sick and dying. Priests who had devoted their entire lives to the gods died at exactly the same rate as men who had never once prayed. When the pious die alongside the impious without distinction, the argument for piety collapses. The Athenians drew the obvious conclusion: the gods were either unable to help or had decided not to. Either way, the practical case for religious observance had been destroyed in real time. Second to go, the long view. When you have watched 3 people you know die this week, when you genuinely believe you may be dead by next week, the concept of long-term obligation becomes absurd. Why honor debts? Why respect property? Why submit to laws designed for a society you may not live to inhabit? Men spent their entire savings in days. They seized property with no legal claim. They took what they wanted because tomorrow the plague might take them. Today was all they had. Third to go, the dignity of death itself. In Athens, funeral rites were not optional. They were communal, elaborate, necessary. The mechanism by which the living processed grief and the dead were sent properly into whatever came next. The plague made them impossible. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be cremated. Funeral pyres built by one family were seized by others, who threw their own dead onto the flames before the original pyre had finished. Some bodies were simply left where they fell. The city that had just heard Pericles speak about noble tombs was now stacking its dead in the streets. Thucydides does not say Athens became monstrous. He says something far more disturbing. Athens became honest. The plague stripped away the social performances that civilization requires and left only the raw arithmetic of survival. Rational people, impossible conditions, perfectly understandable choices, and collectively, those choices were destroying everything. While Athens was collapsing from the inside, the war continued. It did not pause, it did not slow down. Sparta continued its strategy. Athens continued its strategy. Men were still being deployed. Ships were still being launched. Sieges were still being conducted, all while the plague swept through a city that could barely stand. Athens had forces at Potidaea, a northern city under siege. When the plague arrived among the 4,000 Athenian soldiers there, more than 1,000 died of disease before they ever faced a Spartan weapon. The siege continued anyway, because abandoning it would signal weakness Athens could not afford to show. The navy kept raiding the Peloponnesian coast, as Pericles' plan required. Those ships carried the plague with them. Wherever Athenian sailors landed, whatever they touched, whoever they met, the disease traveled with them, invisible and indifferent, unable to distinguish ally from enemy. And this is the structural catastrophe that Pericles could not have foreseen. Athens' greatest strength, its mobile navy, its ability to project power anywhere in the Mediterranean, had become the plague's most efficient delivery system. The ship that could blockade a coast could infect it. The sailor who raided a harbor went home carrying something worth more to Sparta than any battlefield victory. Even Sparta recognized what was happening. When Archidamus led his army into Attica a second time in 430 BC, his soldiers reportedly refused to press close to the city walls. The evidence was visible from a distance. Columns of funeral smoke rising over Athens, the sounds of a city in crisis, the conspicuous absence of Athenian military response. The Spartans retreated earlier than planned, not out of respect, not out of mercy, out of fear. Sparta's greatest enemy had become something it did not need to fight. Back inside the walls, the Athenian assembly had reached a decision. Someone had to pay for this. And they knew exactly who. Pericles had governed Athens for 30 years by reading the assembly's mood and finding the argument that could move it. He had survived prosecutions of his allies. He had survived attacks on Aspasia. He had outlasted every rival who thought they could displace him because he was simply better at this than they were. He could not survive grief. The Athenian demos had followed his strategy with extraordinary discipline. They had watched the Spartans burn their farms. They had stayed inside the walls. They had trusted the plan. And then the plague had come and killed their children, and the farms were still ash, and the siege at Potidaea was still bleeding men, and the war showed no sign of resolution, and the man who had told them it would all be worth it was going to answer for it. The assembly voted to prosecute him. The charges were financial, the standard political weapon in Athens, transparently manufactured, but effective. He was convicted, fined heavily. For the first time in living memory, Pericles did not control the assembly. He had spent 40 years being the most persuasive man in the most eloquent city on earth, and now the argument he needed to make, that the long game still worked, that discipline now meant survival later, required a city that still believed in tomorrow. The plague had made tomorrow feel like a lie. He gave one more speech. Thucydides records it as his most honest. No promises of easy victory, no assurance that the plan was working, only a harder, colder claim that individual suffering cannot be allowed to determine collective strategy. That the city is larger than any one person's grief, larger than any season's catastrophe, larger than the plague itself. That Athens, if it remains Athens, can still survive this. The crowd listened. They reinstated him. The Athenians were nothing if not volatile, but the political damage was permanent. He had been seen as vulnerable. In a democracy, that wound does not close. And then the plague took his sons. Both of his legitimate heirs, Pericles, then Xanthippus, died in the epidemic. We have no detailed account of how Pericles received these losses. What Thucydides gives us is a single image. Pericles at the funeral of his last son, placing the wreath on the body and weeping. He had maintained his composure through everything, through the prosecutions, through the political attacks, through watching the city burn from within. Here he could not. He had one other son, Pericles the younger, his child with Aspasia, his companion of many years. But Aspasia was from Miletus, which made her a foreigner under Athenian law, and the citizenship law that excluded foreign-born mothers from producing Athenian citizens, the law Pericles himself had championed, meant his only surviving heir had no legal standing in the city his father had defined. Pericles had to go before the assembly that had just prosecuted him and beg for an exception. They granted it. The man who had built the rules could not survive inside them. Shortly after, Pericles contracted the plague himself. Not the acute form, not the 7-day death sentence. A slower version that wore him down over weeks and months, clouding the precise intelligence that had governed Athens for a generation. In his final weeks, friends came to visit. They pointed to amulets that had been placed around his neck, traditional charms, put there by women following custom, asking the gods to spare him. Pericles had stood beside Anaxagoras when that philosopher said the sun was not a god, but a burning rock. He had spent his life as the most rational man in Athens. In his last days, he could not speak to reject the amulets. He died in 429 BC. The plague took him. The plague his strategy had made inevitable. The plague that arrived through the crowded door of the city he had filled with people who had nowhere else to go. Here is the thing about certain leaders that institutions consistently fail to understand until it is too late. They are not replaceable, not in the short term, not by talent alone. What Pericles had provided was not just strategy or rhetoric. He provided coherence, the function that held Athens's competing factions in working tension. The hawks and the doves, the old aristocracy and the commercial class, the imperialists and the pragmatists. He managed all of them simultaneously, not through force but through being demonstrably more capable than any challenger. When he died, the factions did not merge. They separated. Two figures moved into the space he left, each carrying one part of what was needed, neither capable of holding the whole. Nicias was a competent general, cautious, experienced, genuinely committed to ending the war through negotiation. He understood that Athens was consuming itself faster than it was consuming Sparta. He was probably right. What he lacked was the capacity to impose that judgment on an assembly that increasingly wanted something louder. Cleon was that something louder. A populist from the commercial class, not old Athenian aristocracy, he understood how the demos worked in crisis. They wanted someone who sounded angry and certain and willing to punish the enemy and punish weakness and punish anyone who suggested that Athens could not still win everything. He was rhetorically skilled in a way that was entirely unlike Pericles, not measured and precise but aggressive and emotionally raw. Between them, there was no strategy. There were two competing instincts, excessive caution and reckless aggression, and Athens would lurch between them for 20 more years. Then the plague returned. A second wave, 427 to 426 BC. Less devastating than the first, but landing on a population already reduced and demoralized, reminding everyone that the disease had not finished. The total death toll across both waves was likely a quarter to a third of Athens's entire population. Among the military-age men, the hoplites, the naval officers, the experienced administrators, the percentage may have been higher. Athens was now fighting a prolonged war with a degraded officer corps, a depleted treasury, a traumatized citizenry, and no leader capable of holding the strategic line. The margin for catastrophic error had narrowed to almost nothing. No one inside the walls fully understood this yet. They were about to find out what it meant. In 427 BC, the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos revolted from the Athenian Empire. Several allied cities had tried the same during the plague years, sensing Athenian weakness. Athens had crushed them all. It would crush this one too. But what the Athenian assembly did after Mytilene's surrender is the most revealing moment of the entire post-Pericles period. It shows, more precisely than any battle or any speech, what the plague had done to the city's core. The assembly voted to execute every adult male in Mytilene, every single one. Not just the revolt's leaders, not just the soldiers who had fought, every man, and to sell every woman and child into slavery. For the crime of rebellion. A trireme was dispatched with the order. The debate was closed. Athens had decided. The next morning, the assembly reconvened. In the cold light of a day without the previous day's fury, enough Athenians felt they had gone too far to force another vote. Cleon argued again for the maximum penalty, not out of cruelty, he said, but out of strategic necessity. Empire required terror. Mercy would invite every other allied city to calculate that revolt was worth the risk. His opponent, Diodotus, countered with something colder and more pragmatic. Not that slaughter was wrong, but that it was bad strategy. Cities facing total annihilation would fight to the last man rather than surrender. Athens would spend more blood taking cities that otherwise might yield. The assembly voted again, narrowly this time, for mercy. A second trireme was launched immediately. Its rowers told that every stroke would determine whether thousands of people lived or died. They rowed through the night without stopping. They arrived at Mytilene just as the first ship's captain was reading the original order to the Mytilenean authorities, in time, barely, to countermand it. The men of Mytilene lived. 1,000 of the revolt's leaders were executed, which Athens considered restrained. But the episode is not a story of redemption. It is a story of how close Athens came, in a single afternoon vote, in a city that still called itself the school of all Greece, to an act of mass murder against its own subjects. The second vote saved Mytilene. It did not explain away the first. Pericles' Athens had been capable of cruelty. The empire was never gentle, but it had been cruelty restrained by a governing intelligence that understood long-term legitimacy required at minimum the appearance of principle. Without that restraint, without that intelligence, Athens was showing the assembly its own darkest instincts in full daylight, and nobody could stop it. The Peloponnesian War lurched through the 420s in an exhausting rhythm of victories and losses. Athens captured a force of Spartan soldiers at Pylos, an event that shocked the Greek world because Spartan soldiers simply did not surrender, and then lost ground badly in Thrace, where the brilliant Spartan general Brasidas outmaneuvered Athenian forces and peeled away key allies. Cleon died chasing Brasidas. Brasidas died in the same battle. The two men most committed to fighting each other were gone in a single afternoon. What followed was the Peace of Nicias in 421 BC, a negotiated settlement, a pause. Both sides had paid enormous costs. Both sides agreed, technically, to return to the pre-war status quo. It should have been the end. Pericles' strategy, battered and stretched across years it was never designed to survive, had produced a result where Athens still stood, still held most of its empire, still commanded the sea. A cautious leadership would have consolidated, recovered, let the peace hold. But cautious was not what Athens had anymore. It had Alcibiades. Understand what Alcibiades was. He was, by raw ability, the most talented Athenian of his generation. Brilliant military mind, political operator of the first order, charismatic in a way that made rooms shift when he entered. Related to Pericles by family, he had absorbed everything the city could teach him about strategy and rhetoric, and then discarded the one quality that had made Pericles great: restraint. Pericles had always subordinated his personal ambition to the city's survival. Alcibiades was incapable of that subordination. He wanted glory. He wanted legacy. He wanted to be the man who had done what no Athenian had ever done before. And in 415 BC, 4 years into the Peace of Nicias, with the wounds from the plague years still not fully healed, he stood before the Athenian assembly and proposed the most ambitious military operation in Athens's history. The target? Sicily, specifically Syracuse, the largest Greek city in the western Mediterranean, sitting on an island 700 miles from Athens. The stated justification was to help an Athenian ally. The real goal was conquest. Take Syracuse, control Sicily, access the resources of the western Mediterranean, build an empire that would make the Delian League look modest. Nicias opposed it openly. He argued that the expedition was too risky, the distance too great, the supply lines too fragile, the intelligence about Syracuse too thin. In a calculated attempt to frighten the assembly into rejection, he deliberately inflated the numbers he said would be required. More ships, more troops, more money than anyone had estimated. The assembly's response destroyed him. They voted for the larger force. Athens committed 134 triremes, tens of thousands of soldiers, and an enormous fraction of its remaining treasury to an expedition against a city it had never seriously analyzed, could not resupply if things went wrong, and had no coherent plan to hold if things went right. Pericles had said, "Do not overextend. Do not fight on two fronts. Do not let ambition override strategy." 4 years after his death, his city voted to do all three simultaneously. Before the fleet even sailed, it fell apart. On the night before departure, religious statues across Athens, the herms, sacred markers at doorways throughout the city, were found mutilated, faces smashed, genitals removed. It was a city-wide desecration of sacred objects on the eve of the greatest military expedition Athens had ever launched. Someone had done it deliberately. In the paranoia of an already traumatized city, the suspects multiplied overnight. Alcibiades was implicated, possibly framed by political enemies who saw their moment. He demanded an immediate trial so he could clear his name before the fleet sailed. His enemies refused. "Let him sail," they said. "Deal with it on his return, when he has less leverage." He sailed. A month later, a ship arrived in Sicily with orders for his arrest. Alcibiades looked at the charges, looked at Athens' political climate, and made a calculation. He was not going back. He defected to Sparta. He gave his own city's greatest enemy a complete intelligence briefing, the full strategic logic of the Sicilian operation, the weaknesses of the Athenian position, and specifically, what Sparta needed to do to destroy it. The expedition continued under Nicias, the man who had never wanted it, who was now ill, who was cautious in exactly the ways this kind of offensive operation could not afford. In Sicily, the Athenians found a city far better prepared than their intelligence had suggested, with terrain that neutralized Athenian naval advantages, with Corinthian and Spartan advisors present who had been warned by Alcibiades exactly what was coming. The siege dragged. Athenian casualties mounted. Nicias, deteriorating physically, sent a letter home asking either for massive reinforcements or permission to withdraw. The assembly sent reinforcements. Another fleet, another general, Demosthenes. Demosthenes arrived, saw the situation clearly, and immediately recommended retreat. It was unwinnable. Leave now, while the sea route was still open. Nicias hesitated. Then a lunar eclipse appeared. The Athenian soothsayers declared it an omen requiring 27 days of delay before any military movement. Nicias, a deeply superstitious man, agreed to wait. In those 27 days, the Syracusans and their allies closed the harbor mouth with a chain of ships. The Athenian fleet attempted to break through. It failed. The army attempted to retreat overland. It was cut to pieces. The generals were captured and executed. 40,000 Athenian and allied soldiers, one of the largest forces Athens had ever assembled, were destroyed. 7,000 survivors were worked to death in stone quarries under the Sicilian sun, given a fraction of a cup of water per day and rations fit for animals. Most of them died within weeks. Athens had lost 2 generations of military manpower, a significant portion of its treasury, and whatever remained of the strategic confidence Pericles had built over 40 years, all in a single avoidable catastrophe. After Sicily, Sparta did what it had spent 20 years unable to do. It found money. Persian gold. Persia watched the Athenian Empire hemorrhaging from the Sicilian disaster and made its calculation. Athens weakened served Persian interests better than Athens strong. With Persian funding, Sparta built a navy, not as good as Athens' fleet, never as good, but good enough, combined with Athenian exhaustion, to contest the Aegean for the first time. Sparta also stopped making seasonal raids into Attica. Instead, it established a permanent garrison at Decelia, a year-round occupation force that denied Athens access to its silver mines at Laurium. Those mines had financed the fleet for decades. Tens of thousands of Athenian slaves escaped to the Spartan garrison. The economic foundation of Athenian power was being systematically dismantled from the outside, while the political foundations continued collapsing from within. Athens fought on. This deserves acknowledgement. Post-Sicily, post-plague, managing a brief oligarchic coup in 411 BC and its restoration, Athens continued to win battles it had no business winning. The naval victory at Arginusi in 406 BC was the largest sea battle of the entire war, an Athenian triumph. And then, in what may be the single most self-destructive act in democratic history, the assembly voted to execute the 8 generals who had won it, because a post-battle storm had prevented them from recovering bodies from the sea. 6 of the 8 who were present were killed, including Pericles the Younger, Pericles' own son, the one who had been granted special citizenship. Athens executed the men who had just saved it. The following year, at Aegospotami, the Spartan admiral Lysander caught the Athenian fleet carelessly beached. He destroyed it. 3,000 Athenian sailors were captured and executed. The survivors fled. The blockade that followed was total. No food in, no trade, no tribute, no relief. In 404 BC, Athens surrendered. The long walls, Pericles' great shield, the walls he had ordered the countryside inside, were torn down, to the sound of flutes. Sparta's allies celebrated the demolition as liberation. The fleet was surrendered. The empire dissolved. The 30 tyrants, a Spartan-backed oligarchic council, were installed and proceeded to execute more Athenians in a matter of months than had died in the final years of the war. It was the end. Not the end of Athens as a city. It survived, recovered some autonomy, continued to exist. But the end of Athens as the thing it had been, the hegemonic power of the Greek world, the proof that democracy could sustain an empire, the city whose first citizen could stand above the war dead and tell his civilization it was immortal. The world did not become more stable once Athens fell. It became less. Sparta had won. And winning revealed everything it lacked. It had the dominant army. It had the prestige. It had the obligations. All the cities that had been promised liberation now expected to be governed wisely. Sparta had none of the tools for that. No economic infrastructure, no diplomatic tradition, no institutional capacity to manage an empire of diverse city-states. Spartan hegemony lasted barely 30 years. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, the Theban general Epaminondas destroyed a Spartan army in a way that had been previously considered impossible. Not by fighting harder, but by thinking differently, using a weighted formation that shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility in a single afternoon. Sparta never recovered. What followed was decades of destabilizing competition between Thebes, Athens, Sparta, and various coalitions, all of them smaller, weaker, and more exhausted than they had been before the Peloponnesian War. And into that exhausted, fragmented landscape, Philip of Macedon began moving south. He was brilliant, patient, and operating against opponents who had spent 50 years destroying each other. By 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, he had crushed the last combined Greek resistance. The era of the independent Greek city-state as the fundamental unit of political power was over. Philip's son Alexander would take what his father built and carry Greek language, Greek philosophy, and Greek art to the edges of the known world. The cultural inheritance of Athens spread further than Pericles could have imagined. But it spread as inheritance, as influence carried in the luggage of conquerors, not as a living political project, governed by free citizens voting in assembly. The world Athens built survived. The Athens that built it did not. There is a version of this story that is simply about a plague. A pathogen arrived, killed a lot of people, weakened a city at war, and the city eventually lost. That version is true. It is also not enough. The deeper story is about the trap inside every perfect plan. Pericles' strategy was not wrong. By the standards of what Athens could control, it was the correct response to its situation. He assessed strengths and weaknesses accurately. He identified the right approach to Sparta's vulnerability. He understood that Athens could not win by fighting and could win by outlasting. The logic held. What it could not account for was a disease that his own strategy made inevitable. The crowding the strategy required created the conditions the plague needed. Without the crowding, the strategy fails. With the crowding, the plague finds its perfect environment. The trap was built into the architecture of the plan itself, invisible, waiting for something outside the strategic framework to spring it. The lesson is not that good strategy is worthless. It is that every strategy operates within a domain it can see, and that the most dangerous threats always arrive from the domain it cannot. The thing that destroys a well-built plan is almost never the thing the plan was designed to defeat. It is the thing the designer did not know to think about. The second thing this story is about is what happens to institutions when the person holding them together is gone. Athens did not lose the war the moment the plague arrived. It lost the war the moment Pericles died. Because what he had provided was not just vision or rhetoric. It was a functioning interface between one man's strategic clarity and a democratic system that was constitutionally incapable of maintaining long-term strategy on its own. The assembly would always move toward whatever felt most satisfying in the moment. Pericles was the mechanism that prevented that from being fatal. The plague removed him. Nothing replaced him. Not because Athens lacked capable people. It had Nicias and Alcibiades and Thucydides and dozens of others. But the function Pericles performed was specific and rare, and replicating it required not just talent, but a particular combination of clarity, skill, and authority that takes decades to build and can be ended in weeks by a microscopic pathogen. And the third thing, the one Thucydides embeds most quietly, is about civilization itself. He describes a city losing its shared agreements, losing its faith in the rules, losing the collective belief that tomorrow is worth planning for. He does not describe this as a failure of character. He describes it as a rational response to irrational conditions. When the rules do not protect you, when the pious die alongside the impious, when tomorrow is genuinely uncertain, the argument for long-term behavioral compliance is very hard to sustain. What this means is that civilization is far more fragile than it appears from the inside. Not because people are essentially barbaric, but because the agreements that hold societies together depend on a shared belief that they are worth keeping. And that belief can be dissolved by events that make the future feel impossible. The plague dissolved it in Athens. The social corrosion outlasted the disease itself. Something in the city's collective psychology had changed in ways that no political recovery could fully repair. Pericles had understood this, which was why the funeral oration mattered so much to him. It was not just rhetoric. It was civic maintenance, the active reinforcement of the beliefs Athens required to function. He was, among everything else, the city's best argument for itself. When he was gone, the argument continued. It just became less convincing. And so the most powerful democratic city-state in the history of the ancient world, the place that invented philosophy and tragedy and the politics of free assembly, whose ideas we still argue about, whose ruins we still visit, fell. Not to an army in the field, not to a king's ambition, to a disease no one could see, arriving through a harbor that could not be closed, into a city that was exactly as crowded as its own best strategy required it to be. Thucydides ends his account of the plague with a quiet observation. He says that some Athenians, having survived the disease once, believed they were immune. They threw themselves into caring for the sick because they had already faced the worst the plague could offer, and they were still standing. He does not say whether their belief in immunity was correct. He says only that they went back into the dying city anyway. That is the part of Athens worth holding. Not the empire, not the strategy, not the democratic machinery that could vote for mass murder in the afternoon and reverse it the next morning. The people who survived the unsurvivable and turned back toward the sick, in a city where the rules had dissolved and survival was the only rational calculation. They did it anyway. That is something Pericles, in his funeral oration, might have recognized as the thing he was actually talking about. Not the buildings, not the navy. The people who, when everything was burning and nothing was promised, still chose to act as though it mattered. He did not live to see it. He died, as they all died, unable to stop what was coming. But it was there. In the smoke and the heat and the terrible arithmetic of 430 BC, the city he had called immortal was still, improbably, stubbornly, worth defending. And the whole earth, he had said, is the tomb of famous men. He was right. He just did not know it would include him so soon.